Welcome back to another devlog. As you can see, I've currently removed the arms on the enemy and made it a bit darker, just so it doesn't look too much like the player character. Also, I needed an attack animation that would swing low enough to hit the player, but be slow enough for the player to see it coming. Oh, and it also needs to not look like it's attacking in slow motion. I also decided to give the enemy a mouth to make it look a little bit more menacing. At this point, it kinda gives me Demogorgon vibes. I of course struggled with how to properly give the closed mouth details as per usual, as well as just contorting the animation to give it the impression that it is attacking. Even just getting the body to look less stiff is a struggle, but I try to keep all of the body parts moving at least a little bit each frame and go with the trial and error approach. I then tried a few different runs of how closed mouth would look in the animation, just to experiment and see what feels like it would fit best. I originally went for the closed tentacle look, but it didn't look fierce enough, so I tried a few different shapes for the closed mouth frame and ended up going for a bigger square shape. From there, I just had to clean up the animation from the lunge back into its idle pose. So of course skipping a few frames and copy pasting the original frames from the lunge just to make life easy. Then I just wiped away the flying particles and added more detail to the transition to make it seem fluid. Then I had to line my feet back up with the starting frame so my sprite doesn't look like it's on ice skates. Now we have a monster idle, activated idle, and an attack animation. Now the only thing missing is some way for a character to be able to pursue the player. So as I'm sure you guessed, we need to work on some form of traversal animation. So like usual, we copy paste our idle frame to get a reference of the image and start to set up all of the frames. Usually run animations go anywhere from 4 to 6 frames, but can be more depending on what you're going for. I, for instance, have no idea what I'm going for, and I'm just trying to place the legs as they fit, and then quickly jumping into the next frame. Then I just play the animation back as I go along, just until I feel like the pace of the animation is where I like it. From there, I will try and go in a bit more and try to clean up the animation just so it looks a little bit more legible. I will also admit that I struggle a lot with all of these animations, but that's just a part of learning, so it just is what it is. Then once I feel like I've nailed down the flow of the animation for the desired limbs, I'll start to add more details so it looks like they actually belong to this body. From there, all I have to do is move the rest of the body and sync with the legs so it looks more natural. And in the end, we have this as a move animation. In my last devlog, I showed off part of my player animation when fleeing away from the enemy. The part that you didn't see is that all I have for the jump is just that, a jump. Which would be fine by itself, but currently looks kinda awkward if you're to jump to a lower platform, as the animation stops and doesn't smoothly transition back into the idle animation, or do anything in between jumping and idle. There's a part in the video titled Secrets of Game Feel and Juice by Game Maker's Toolkit that sums it up perfectly.
How does the game feel even when you strip out the points, the story, the graphics, the music, and the clever level design? Even without all those trappings, is your game still fun to interact with?
I will say that I did design the jump with the intention of making a falling animation. I will also say it was super difficult to find any sort of reference for the sort of falling animation I was going for, so yet again I was stuck with the good old trial and error approach to finding what would work best in the animation. My first idea was to start with the arms, as I more or less assumed they would be naturally going in a clockwise motion forwards. I also did a lot of reenacting in my room of what the fall animation would look like since I couldn't find any good reference images online. The biggest struggle by far was getting the legs to not look super stiff during the animation, especially with the dimensions set to 32 by 32 pixels. I originally started with having both legs together, but I felt like it seemed a little too weird and unnatural when playing the animation back. I then tried adding extra negative space between the legs and ended up going back and forth several times. Of course I managed to push through nonetheless. To be honest, I'm not really sure what I wanted since I didn't really have a solid reference, but I figured if I kept working on it enough, I'd eventually reach a point where I could settle. And after a bit of trial and error, this is what I ended up landing on for the falling animation. Next, I wanted to have a way for the player to dodge out of the way of an attack. Instead of going for the typical dodge roll, I want to do something a little bit different stylistically and instead use a handspring as the dodge animation. And it wasn't all that hard to set up, as there was plenty of references to choose from on Google Images. After setting up a rough draft of the animation, I ended up throwing it into my animation, so now you can dodge left or right with a handspring. I also added the falling animation to the player, as well as the end of the spawn animation. So now if the player jumps from high up, they will relatively smoothly transition into a falling animation, followed by a landing animation. Of course, the landing animation can be interrupted by moving in a specific direction whilst you are landing, and I feel like it gives more juice to the player animations overall. Well, this is kind of awkward. I didn't really think about ledges when I made the dodge animation, but as you can see, the animation looks super stiff when dodging off of a ledge. This is more or less due to the animation having frames where the player is standing up or lifting off of the ground, even if there isn't ground to do so, just because the animation is all done in keyframes. At this point, I'll admit that I'm stumped, as I don't want to disable the player's ability to dodge when near a cliff edge, but I also don't want to reduce the distance you travel during a dodge. So I more or less am going to have to scrap the handspring animation and come back to it later, as I currently want to work on the next attack animation. This animation I was really inspired to try and do because I remember seeing it a lot in different action scenes, and it just looks cool. From what I could find as far as reference goes on Google, it told me that it was called a butterfly palm, originating from a southern Chinese martial arts known as Nan Quan. I apologize if I said that incorrectly. There's a ton of different references here, as it's actually a sport I wasn't even aware of. The animation wasn't too bad to make besides the arms giving me trouble. I was trying to make it feel like the character was kind of waving their hands backwards before launching them both forwards for the lunge. This animation is a few more frames than my first attack, so I have to double check the flow of the attacks and make sure everything works as best as possible. I don't know for sure how many attack animations that I want for the player currently, but I do think that I need more than 2. And now it's time to get back to work on the dodge animation. So the problem with the original dodge animation is the fact that the player was grounded during the animation, meaning during the animation the player had to be quote-unquote grounded for it to look good all the time. So my thought process going into this was that I would need an animation that has 0 grounded frames, and it also needs to have relatively similar end frames to keep the animations looking good when it goes from dodging to falling, idling, or running. With all of that in mind, I figured I could go with a no-handed cartwheel and try to keep the body off the ground during the whole animation. This, of course, is easier said than done, but that's what I was going for. Then it was just a matter of setting everything up. I of course used a human reference just by searching no-handed cartwheel on YouTube, and I just had to try and make everything readable, which if you've tried pixel art before, then you know it's a constant struggle. This animation in particular took me around an hour, maybe a little longer. The hardest part was definitely the legs, as I felt like they were a key component in being able to understand the motion of the animation. But in the end, I think it came out relatively readable. Then all I had to do was swap out the handspring animation with the cartwheel animation, and I have to say I'm pretty happy with how it looks on the ground. Then when we play it off the ledge at 40% speed, you can see the transition seems a bit more fluid. Of course I'll probably come back to these animations at a later date as I do with all my animations, but I personally think it looks a lot cleaner than the handspring animation did. Now it's time to add the enemy to the scene as well as some logic so you can wake it up. As you can see, I got it first try. Okay, well maybe it wasn't first try. Since I haven't really worked on an enemy AI before, this was definitely something new for me. I struggled a lot with getting the pace of the animation where I wanted it, as well as making it feel like an actual enemy and not just a box sliding on the floor. Firstly, I made a script that would handle waking up enemies that are currently hiding or aren't currently active in the scene. They will do this by checking the distance between themselves and the player. As you can see, it's relatively simple. Once in range, it will change the animator state and in turn activating the enemy AI script on the idle behavior. This one is pretty much the same thing as the wake up script, except it's bigger, mainly because it has a few more states to choose from since it will be handling the AI interactions, instead of just needing to know if it should be awake. Currently, I'm satisfied with this as a start for my enemy AI. Next, I plan to start working out combat interactions, as well as what player mechanics will be available at the start of the game. Hopefully everyone enjoyed this devlog, and if you made it till the end, please do leave a like and consider subscribing, as it truly does help me out a ton. And until next time, take it easy. Peace.